Welcome to the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. I'm Vandita Morarka, and today we're talking about narratives of care, which is about how we tell stories about mental health, depression, anxiety, and also survival in ways that really honor complexity without romanticizing suffering and reducing people to their diagnosis. Today's guest for me is very, very special. It's Amrita Tripathi. And before I formally introduce them, Amrita was one of the first few people I wrote for and wrote with, and they really got me to think about my mental health in a way that was beyond a label, that was much more about what I had learned and what I could share ahead. And now moving on to the formal part, right?
Love.
Amrita is a brilliant writer. They work across fiction, nonfiction, and journalism to explore what she calls the darker side of urban realities. She's the author of the novels Broken News and The Sibious Knot, both of which grapple with mental health and the fragility of relationships. She's also co-authored the Mindscape trilogy with leading psychologists, looking at real stories of dealing with depression, young mental health, and the age of anxiety. And most recently, their book that's out is The Other Sister, which I have an autographed copy of, described by Scroll as an unconventional, brave novel about the unbearable emptiness of virtual living. Perhaps most significantly, especially for me, she's the founder and editor of the Health Collective, a website she started 9 years ago to share credible information on mental health and mental illness from an Indian lens. The site today has published over 450 stories that really center lived experiences and create what she calls an online safe space. The conversations that Indian media has historically underserved and often ignored. Amrita, big welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I wanna mic drop and just leave now. I don't think it's gonna get better than that. Thank you for that. And I'm so delighted that we crossed paths that many years ago, which is almost a decade and change, I think, when we first started brainstorming and writing and creating content and just telling stories around topics that people didn't really seem to care about back then.
Yeah, it feels like for me, Health Collective's just always been there. So sometimes just 9 years feels like a surprise, but also 9 years is a long time. Yeah, so I'm going to start off by asking you something about that you wrote in the Health Collective, right, around setting it up. There are many different ways to talk about mental health and mental illness in India, but probably there are even more ways to not talk about this issue, which has been the norm for generations, I feel, even today. So, what is it that made you decide that this silence needs breaking? And why did you choose storytelling? Why did you feel like it was the right tool for you?
So, because I was a journalist and I was trained as a journalist, storytelling came naturally. There was no other way that I was going to approach this. And I will say that the mainstream media does get, a bad rap for a lot of things. But we, at that time, did try to get a lot of stories about health and specifically mental health on air. But unfortunately, you realize with the news cycle being what it was, and this, by the way, was a tamer era, but again, 20 years ago, the news looked very different. The news cycle and the news ecosystem was very different. But at that time, I realized as I was a health editor, I was, trying to report on mental health. I was hearing from psychologists and psychiatrists that we were underserving this very important area. And it's only after I left that I actually realized that, we were following a very set pattern of using foreign or international stories following those leads, getting a few quotes or sound bites from Indian experts, and ideally getting one quote from somebody, and then there was like this is just a template that we kept following. We didn't have that many stories of lived experience. We didn't have that many people who wanted to share. And again, broadcast being what it is, not everyone is going to be comfortable going on camera as well. But cut a long story short, I think when I decided to set up the Health Collective, I thought initially my idea was that we should at least put helplines and resources up. That was triggered by a tweet I saw from someone I didn't know who was looking for help for his friend. And I saw the tweet 2 days later, and I've shared this story before, but it really upset me that it was quite distressing that, for 2 days, someone was sitting there, didn't know how to access even very basic rudimentary helplines. And so we started as a resource. And then because I had that network of psychologists and psychiatrists, we were able to share credible information. I think for me, the important thing in all of this is to say that you have to center around something. I mean, one is do no harm. You can probably do much more harm by having great intentions, but not thinking through the approach. So I did, of course, rely on a few advisors on just ensuring that we were, moving the right direction. And then people started asking, can we share our stories? So the first 3 or 4 people decided to share their stories on living with schizophrenia, living with bipolar disorder, and living with depression. I realized that we have something here that needs more space, so it actually transformed into a site that really puts lived experience at the center because of those early folks who trusted us. And, they were not necessarily going to share with their full names. One was anonymous, one was with a pseudonym, but they made me realize. And I think what I love about this is that it's also, instead of going like top down as you sometimes do as a journalist, you're like, okay, I know what I need to tell the story and this is how we're going to tell it. It was very democratic. It was very like, I'm learning as much from you. It is actually, we call it a tribe now, but it actually was the start of the tribe and that whole ecosystem.
Thanks for that. As you were speaking, just for disclosure for everyone listening in, that I was a former and writer at the Health Collective and now a supporter. I think one of my stories was published anonymously because I felt so, I think, afraid of being judged. I remember even telling you about like, what would my future employment prospects look like? And I was much younger. And now, like maybe 2 years ago, I would have published with my name.
That's interesting.
So just having a space like that, one that it allowed me to voice my story, um, it gave so much resonance because so many people I saw resonate with the story, not knowing it was mine.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of acceptance around the story, which
Yeah.
I think encouraged me to now be able to even talk to the people in my lives about what was happening, which is just really special because I remember how difficult that felt to put out something into the world. On video, I would never do it. That I don't think I'd do today also. But to
Yeah.
be able to write about it anonymously was very special. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think that really speaks to, why so many people want to share. I think a lot of people do want to share because they don't want anyone else to feel as alone as they felt, which is also a really sad indictment of the system as it operates. But it makes you realize that stories travel. And I'm also actually a fan in this case more of the written word because I think people can read quietly alone and have that sort of interaction with the story in a way that may not be as possible on video. But thank you so much for sharing that story with us, for entrusting us with it, and thank you also for the columns you've done. And I'm hoping in post-production Anjali can put some of your columns in because Vandita, I have to say, she sort of blazed onto the scene and had these fantastic legal know your rights columns, right? Which we had not even started thinking about. Why would that be important? We were talking about health insurance for the first time for mental health. And I remember that series being, I literally feel like that was yesterday, which gives you a sign also of like how old I've become. But I still remember the early days very, very clearly. And it was fantastic to have you. I know you referred other people to write for us as well. And the one thing I feel later that is sort of validation this many years later is people will come up once in a while and say either that reading someone else's story made a difference or sharing their own story helped them feel that a burden had lifted. So thank you again for that.
No, of course. And we're speaking of mental health over the last few years, but I'm also going back to your earlier novels, Broken News, The CBS Not. I think for a while it's dealt with mental health, right? The darker side of urban realities, lots of struggles about relationships. But when you were writing these, given that they're fiction novels, were you really thinking about, okay, I'm writing about mental health? Or was it just something that emerged? Yeah, I see you.
No, I'm always torn between when I have like lovely interlocutors who ask me questions about my books. Like I'm always torn between being that like, listen, I am this wise sage who knew always what the story would be. Um, it's absolutely not. I didn't start out, and I don't think a novel. I mean, even today, like so, the latest book, as you mentioned, The Other Sister. There's no question that it has very strong themes of mental health, mental illness, and we grapple with some of those issues. We grapple with grief in the book. But I don't think you can tell a story, or I certainly can't, I think in fiction, try and tell a story by saying, I'm going to impose, and I have to make this sort of, create this world, because that's what you're doing as a novelist. And I need to make that world believable. I cannot impose upon that world to say that, it has to fit a certain kind of superstructure that I've decided that's going to be like, let me tell you the 5 tenets of, mental health awareness. So no, but at the same time, Vandita, I think, and we've had so many conversations now, I think over the years, it's easier to have certain conversations around mental health and illness in India. And certain conversations are still very much shrouded in, stigma and darkness, and it's still a struggle. But we find it easier now to understand that mental health affects everything, right? Like everyone has mental health, good days, bad days. Everyone might not have a diagnosis, but everyone's bound to have, ups and downs in their life. And you realize that mental health affects every single part of your experience. So I think in Broken News, I was still pretty green. It was my first novel. I had colleagues, picking it up to see who was in it, and it was usually amalgamations of people. But there is a breakdown in that. There is a tragic death in that. At those days, I was still finding my voice, I think, in a way, as a journalist as much as a storyteller. By the time the CBS Not came in 2015, 5 years later, I was very much in the weeds doing documentaries on very difficult topics, I would say, that kind of found their way in. So CBS Not is much more about adolescent and young adult lives coming to terms with reality, and mental health plays a huge role there. And then by now, where I think that, you also sometimes don't realize, but your life trickles in. So I have said that, the other sister, I started writing it and then I stopped. I lost my father in that process. And, that just changed everything. It just changed my whole world. And it's only much later when I picked up the book again and started like working on it. And almost when I'd finished it, I realized, hey, you know what? You've sort of, that grief journey, that sort of love, that those tributes are in the writing. Some of it, of course, is conscious. It's not like it's all of it is subconscious. But you realize later that different aspects of these subjects, depending on whether it is lived experience or depending on whether you really care about these, they will come into your fiction. And I think that's kind of what's happened, rather than, though again, like I said, I would have loved to say that I planned it this way. I'm such a genius and sage.
I would say I actually prefer that you said you didn't, because it makes me feel like mental health then is just a part of your life. It's not a theme you add on to a story, right? And I think that's what comes through your books. Like, I never feel like what I'm reading about is mental health. I'm reading about people's lives, and then just the way I would get sick and have a fever, or get really sick and be in the hospital for something physical. It just feels like it feels natural and it feels normal to see ups and downs in mental health. And I think that's quite powerful as well. I, in fact, struggle sometimes to pick up books where the theme and the selling point is that it's a book on mental health. I don't think I'd pick that up because, I mean, it's not like everyone's mental health is great, right? It's already shit. I'd rather pick up something that's that's not talking about it. But yeah, no, I'm glad you said it that way. I'm actually going to go to a question that made me think of what you said right now. Is I know that the Health Collective, all of its publications, you had a big focus on lived experience. And you've done it in different ways, with expert columns, with first person narratives. It's one of the first few places where lived experience is central.
Yeah.
It's not like like a small part of a larger article, or it's not like the section, people's stories. What made you do that? Why are lived experiences and first person stories so central to the Health Collective?
I think that's a two-part, but I'll keep it quick. I just realized I promised that I'd have an internal timer for this. But one is genuinely, I think the first four people who shared their stories with me made me realize that this is a bigger project. This is a bigger initiative than just Amrita and friends setting up a reporting, website on mental health and mental illness. Again, not to conflate the two, but in India at that time we had so little journalism, so little original reporting, so few columns on these subjects that would have also been a very valid way, I think. At the outset, it felt like a very valid path to take, just to say that we're going to do original reporting and we're just going to inform people constantly. Those four people, it's three or four stories that, I've been trying to dig through the archives so I can also share. But they made me realize that just as there's so little space, there's zero space for these stories. And it's what you were saying slightly earlier in this conversation. When people come back to me later, like 5, 6, 7 years later, quietly at a conference, so they've met me somewhere, to say that sharing their story made them feel valued, their voice valued, that there's some validation that comes from someone saying, hey, listen, I will find space to tell your story, even if I'm not commissioning it. So, there are a lot of ethical issues with this kind of subject matter. You don't want to commission. You want to make sure people are aware, like you said also, that potentially, the internet lives forever. Your content on the internet lives forever. So there may be, ramifications for your personal and professional life. So I'm pretty clear. I have talked people out of sharing their full bylines or identifying circumstances as well. But there's a very strong ethical component to this. I think what I realized though at a fundamental level, and this had nothing to do with the journalism, this had nothing to do with like, oh, the Health Collective is going to be something that stands the test of time. It was that as a reader, when I read those stories, I'm like, holy, expletive. I had no idea that people are going through so many things, and there's nothing common. Like, again, like you can't reduce all of these things to that one you sort of qualifying characteristics that I have a mental illness or they're just completely different stories in different parts of the country or the world, and they needed to be told. And I think that the joy of, like, we talk a lot about the downside of tech, and that's a whole different conversation. But I think the joy of what's happened in the last 10 to 15 years is all of a sudden sitting in Delhi without funding, because the smart thing would have been to wait for funding, which we never did. You can just be like, actually, let me enable this in a way that, again, stay safe, feel safe. We did have to get some editorial oversight in from, like, sort of the trained experts, of course, for several pieces. So I don't want to make it sound like it's, less complicated than it is. But the stories really spoke to everyone who read them, and certainly to me, to say that there's something beyond just the original reportage, like in the facts of the case. So I feel like that's kind of the tension I sometimes feel even today when I'm like trying to justify my existence as a writer of fiction and nonfiction. It's like, how do you pick? How do you pick what matters more? But yeah, I'd be curious to know if you find that the nonfiction or the reportage impacts you more, or the stories, the individual stories.
I feel like for me, the reporting has always felt like data I must do something with. But I think the stories make me like it builds the will to take action. I think reportage is great for knowledge and awareness. But if you, like me or anybody, even the other, like we work with a lot of emerging leaders at One Future Collective, I think what moves people to action is recognizing who is that person actually affected beyond the numbers, beyond the report. I think that's a very powerful lever to move someone to change.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I
And now
think
it's de rigueur, like you said, everyone has accepted the importance of
yeah,
lived experience, expertise.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it swings um, not in the best way. And you mentioned some of it around ethics and safety.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to maybe, move it up and talk
Yeah.
a little about that. Let's start with consent, perhaps, given that, we're talking about a platform where people are really sharing really difficult experiences. I also started by sharing my example where I said I was scared for, will someone hire me? If they know this
Yeah.
about me, would they hire me?
Yeah.
So how do you think about consent? What advice do you give to people wanting to share their stories? You mentioned you've negotiated people out of, their
Yeah.
bylines. So how do you do that?
Walking them off the leg. No, it's actually a very difficult thing to do, because you're trying to, sort of thread that needle of saying your story is important. You
Yeah.
should live in a space or environment or ecosystem which doesn't judge you for this. But we know the reality of sitting in, a Delhi, Mumbai, even, let alone a Lucknow, or a Nagpur, or other cities, versus, say, the US, where you have, I was on a panel with a writer there who said it's so normal to talk about having depression or anxiety, even, right? That took us so much longer to get to that place. It's still not normalized or mainstreamed, but I would still say it's easier to talk today about anxiety disorders and depression than schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. That's not changed. So for me, the ethics, so I had to run a few things by a few people, because I think the big difference between, working for a news organization and learning the ropes and then getting senior, but still working for an organization versus setting up my own, was that I had to really get smart on a lot of different things. And, like, at some level, of course, I can say that I want to publish all the stories under the sun. And we were working on a book, in fact, on young mental health. My co-authors for all of the nonfiction have been trained psychotherapists or psychiatrists and people I trust. And one of the essays we got in that young mental health book, for example, was from someone who was sharing a very, very difficult chapter. And it actually was like, just, I don't even know how to explain. It was just blowing up off the page. And I had to ask my co-author to take the call and say, like, do you think this is something we can publish? And it means a lot to this young writer. And of course, I have also managed to we figured out a commission in this case, etc. And she said, absolutely, you cannot, because you'll be triggering a lot of people. And I do want to talk about trigger warnings later, but she said, you're going to literally be doing damage, but there's no question. So, in some cases, I feel like having that humility of also knowing that you're not, you don't get to have the final say. It was a very difficult conversation to have with that writer. We had published other work of hers, and very sadly, she is no more. So, just sending a thought and prayer out to her as well. But I think, coming to your point on the ethics of this, I feel like I keep coming back to the do no harm. So if there's any iota of a hint or suspicion that somebody is going to be harmed, or there's going to be someone who's going to feel worse, for reading something or seeing a comic, because we, at one point we were very big on artists and comics also on the site, I would just say that it's not worth it, because I think I also had to balance out this idea of growing very quickly, and like everyone else in this sort of tech obsessed era of saying like the numbers you have to keep showing, exponential growth, etc. To one day just sitting down and being like, Jesus, like these are like individual people. These are people who are entrusting us. Again, this thing I took very seriously, entrusting us with their stories. And if somebody wants to change something, if somebody wants to take something down, you have to give them that courtesy. You have to extend that respect. But it's such a tricky thing, Vandita, because I feel like sometimes when you're telling someone, so for example, if you and I having the chat, I probably would have gotten better at it by now than when I started out. But I would be very sensitive to saying, I don't want to put this idea in your head that um, it's not a safe world. Like, I don't want to make you paranoid. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to be like, oh, you shouldn't. Certainly, I don't take from like I didn't take from minors. Even for the young mental health book, we took a call to not interview, anyone below 18. And even for folks who were 18, 19, we'd ask them a couple of times, just to be sure that you're comfortable, or do you want to change your name, and see, etc. But yeah, my long garbled answer. I mean, it should be clearer than this. But I feel like if you look at most journalists, we don't always have the luxury of thinking about the big picture because you're kind of doing a story day after day after day. But because this was also my setup and I didn't have that pressure, and I wasn't working with advertisers, and I was not like a huge commercial giant that has to churn out content constantly, I just make that as a distinction of saying, if sometimes success, sort of the pitfalls of success are that you cut those corners, right? And you forget that there's a person at the heart of this, as a reader, as a person, and that contributor as a person. But we had there's certain certain advice we got along the way. For example, from a senior therapist who said, don't commission first person stories of lived experience. You should not be commissioning them because you can't actually fact check them. You can't edit them. You don't want to be an ambulance chaser, right? Like, because you can't just go around telling people like, I need to, mine your life for all the tragic details. So I stuck to that. I would tell people, if you can make, if you're someone with lived experience and you want to report on sort of a larger trend, or you want to actually like use that to inform your reporting, we'll figure out the budgets, etc. But I think ethics is something that now everybody uses as a sort of quick catchphrase, but very few people really put the time and thought into it. And again, I will wind this long ass answer down by telling you that I think the problem now with focusing so much on lived experience expertise is it's a box that's being ticked, and we have not even come to terms with all the data we have put out there on social media. So all those reels, all the information you're giving, companies who don't know you, people who are scraping this data don't give a flying F about like, you or me or anyone listening to this, right? So I think that it's become a much more existential issue than it was, at least we knew that it was when I started. So even more reason to think about, what are you sharing? How much of your life are you sharing? Why are you performing on social media if you don't need to? Like, and just thinking through those larger questions.
Thanks for sharing that. I actually hadn't thought of some of those things in that context, especially the therapist saying the first person narrative thing. Um, because it's always such a tricky line, right? Like, if it is expertise, then do you commission it? Do you pay for it a certain way? Do you take it through a certain process? But is there a way to then process expertise differently? I don't know. So I think that's definitely something I'm going to take back and think about, because I feel like I've been on the other end of it where I have done that, where I have commissioned or maybe like solicited first person stories towards an experience. And I still don't know how I feel about that. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And also thanks for sharing the process. I think I'm going to call it like an independent media setup, right? Which looks at mental health. I think it would be really useful to a lot of people listening in to think about, how does one do that with care, but also how do you do it by allowing yourself the grace to learn along the way. And I think that's really, really important, because sometimes there's so much pressure to have it all figured out when you start. And mental health, especially, is something that's so uniquely different to each person that you're not going to, I don't think you can have an SOP around it. You can't always have a system to how you're going to do this, right? You mentioned you want to talk about trigger warning. So maybe I'm going to get to that question. You've learned through each conversation, you've said, to be perhaps more sensitive about triggering language. But I'd be curious to understand, one, how that happened, but also what is triggering language when you're talking about
Yeah.
mental health and
Yeah.
storytelling? And how do you balance honesty with difficulty? You mentioned you didn't commission, like you didn't take on one story for a book because it could have been triggering for others. Um, but how does one make that call? Like, how do you
Yeah.
balance that care for readers? Yeah,
It's
I don't know.
it's very difficult, and and again, I mean, I again wish I had all the answers. I've also changed a little bit about how I approach even commissioning or budgeting for content, when it is lived experience expertise, because, I think the understanding now is very different from what it was 9 or 10 years ago, which is to say that, if we are looking at like a collection of essays that's being published and there's actually a commercial, whatever tiny little, advance you're getting, like of course, we split those sort of advances and stuff like that. It was easier to some extent to tell people because, the Health Collective wanted to stay non-paywall, have an understanding of how we're going to operate in this space, but not only then be catering to folks of privilege who can afford to send you articles and take the time to write things for free, right? There's so many layers to this. I will come to, I always learn from Vandita, by the way, those of you listening. So I will wait to hear where she lands on this. It's very difficult when you're in that editorial position, because again, I think that in a way that's really nice, you feel that responsibility. It's a good thing. It's never a burden, but it weighs heavy, right? Because I think so many people have had their stories like, either poorly edited or re-edited to mean something they didn't, or just in the interest of having a clickbaity headline, taking that language that I would say is maybe the toughest part of a piece is, goes up in the headline because it's guaranteed to get you hundreds and thousands more hits than the way perhaps it was delicately framed. And like the story in its the context really matters there. So these are all things that you have to kind of grapple with and think through. And I think it's important to have people you trust as advisors, because as I said, of course I've made mistakes also. Like there have been times that I made mistakes I'm not proud of. I don't think giving myself grace doesn't come easy to me, as you know. So it's taken me years to just acknowledge that maybe in a way, because there was no one who had charted this path before me, I didn't really have someone to look up to or follow in this way. But I did have the good sense, at least, to have advisors around me. And we don't always agree, of course. But I come back to the do no harm, and I come back to what the vision and mission was, which was to raise awareness and work towards, ending stigma and understand that each of us is carrying that stigma with us. So about the triggering language, I will say that I didn't know this until I think I was answering a question to Tanmoy Goswami, who runs the newsletter Sanity by Tanmoy, and he was the world's first mental health correspondent with a correspondent when that was around. But he had actually given me this heads up that there's been research that's done to show that trigger warnings are actually not helpful. So I'm just going to read this to you, which said that research shows that they may end up doing more harm than good. So, for example, that's because they raised your anxiety levels beforehand. It's not that also we're supposed to avoid everything that makes us anxious. There's a bigger debate going on, right, globally about this. It's not that you're supposed to avoid everything that you disagree with. I think you need to, in some cases, like sort of grapple with some of those issues. You do need some sort of way of coping with things. But at the very least, I will say, I don't know if the studies are conclusive or not, but at the very least, it seems that using this sort of trigger warning phrase, etc., may have unintended consequences. So we're kind of rethinking that. But also, again, it's all threading that needle of, what's the story that you're trying to tell? And I have to keep coming back to the reason, everyone obsesses about traffic and hits and impressions, because that is the business model, right? So it's like, if I'm going to now say that I may not use the most dramatic, objectively dramatic piece of this story in the headline, which I know will be clickbait, then I have to sort of lump it with the consequences. Like I have to be okay with the consequence of that being, we're not gonna, so a long time ago, by the way, and again, not to ramble on this, but one of the things you have to think about very quickly, sort of very early in this journey, is how are you planning to monetize this? And are you planning to monetize this at all? And I was like, I don't want advertise. There was a brief moment where I was like, so nice it would be to have ads, get some revenue, stop stressing about how to keep this going. But you can imagine the kind of ads that would be targeted to this very vulnerable group of people who are coming on your website in the first place, right? It's not going to be all like sunshine and daisies. You're going to have very specific. So we decided not to enable ads. Again, very, very grateful for supportive friends and family who are like, listen, this is going to be your philanthropy of your lifetime, probably. But I think you have to grapple with these things. So the world is telling you something, by the way, that's completely opposite. I might get pats on the back now, which I love, and the validation is wonderful. They're not always as thoughtful as you, by the way. People you've actually gone through like you will also send me, I know, a critique if you need to, and you've gone through our journey. But I think the world is not going to help you do a good thing. Let's put it that way. So it's not, the system is not designed for you to create an, as I said, making sure it's a safe space is very, like, how do you do that? And nowadays people ask me for this like gimmicky like 2-line answer in these tech conferences. I'm like, it's not like you get to create a community just because it's, it's the buzzword right now that everyone needs communities. People can pick up very quickly on your intentions, especially when it's marginalized or vulnerable populations, right? So when you're looking at setting up something like this that's going to have a life of its own, that's beyond your sort of vision, you have to be very alert to, and you have to have people you trust to give you feedback on these kind of unintended consequences, whether it's like using trigger warnings, because everyone's using that phrase, trigger warnings, or whether it's saying that, listen, we're going to go against the grain and say no online ads, at a time when everyone was raking it in, I think, because with the online ads. So you kind of have to stand your ground and just go back to your own first principles in a way.
I love that. I feel like there are three key tangibles in my brain from what you're saying. One is especially about the money. Recently, I heard someone say it in this way where they said sometimes if you're trying to do equity and bottom lines together, you're going to let equity go. And that's a choice you need to make, but it has to be an intentional choice. So I think that's something I'm really taking away, that if you're going to do something like this, you have to think about what's a priority for you, right? And that's a strong part of ethics. So I think that's one definite key thing. Second, I also heard you say this a few times. It's just like having a core group around you that can keep you like morally upright, maybe, or like on the straight path and like keeping you going. And third, what I'm hearing throughout is just this idea of like community accountability as well. Because over time, I think it has become a space where people can check in and people can ask for things to be a certain way. And maybe a part of this is also like being open to new research, new ideas, and being willing to challenge like very well established processes, even when it can be a little unpopular, can lead to you being cancelled. Like, for example, the trigger warning thing, right? I remember there was an entire period, a few years, where if you didn't use it, that in itself would become such an issue. So even to make that transition, um, and it's so interesting for me because this happened at another space I was recently in where we were working with survivors. And we had people from very different backgrounds in that space, but people who do gender work in very urban elite spaces as well. And a lot of people sharing their experiences didn't use trigger warnings. And people got really pissed that they weren't using trigger warnings. They didn't get triggered. They just got pissed, right? Which is very different. And it took me such a while to bring that in to say, but we knew we're convening for this. They are doing everything with empathy. Just the shared language and the way of being is very different. So I think one was that. And second, also, like sometimes if someone's sharing their life's experience and you know you're in a room for that, it is very difficult to keep asking that person to tell you what I'm going to tell you about my life is now going to trigger you potentially. When they've already said, okay, this is the broader theme of today. So, like, be prepared. Yeah, no, thanks for those. I think that's really the last part, especially, I think, to be challenged by new research. Sorry, I feel like you want to say something.
Yeah, no, I love the way you just said that. That's true. Like my life might trigger you, but I just feel like, again, we're putting the onus on the individual, and it's not to say, like, how these terms have also come into like the popular sort of lexicon, like, trauma dumping everyone talks about, or like, your parents are narcissists, or everything that Instagram tells you we believe now, because it's just everywhere. But it just, you have to sit with these things even in your regular life sometimes, to be like, listen, your friend telling you about this terrible thing that happened is not trauma dumping. Okay, maybe if they, there's a certain set of circumstances for you to that are required for you to call it that. But yeah, thank you. That's actually a very, very clear, much clear. Let's use a three-point summary of what I said. zip through what I said.
No, but also like what you just said about the trauma dumping in friends part, I think sometimes that's just what friends are supposed to do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Go on.
No, just that. Like I feel I have gone that way and now come back this way because it made me feel very alienated with myself and with people around me. Social media's language of mental health
Oh,
is very Western, it's very individualized, and it seeks me to take all of my troubles to this one medicalized relationship. And it just takes away my responsibility to show up as a person and to expect others to show up for me,
yeah,
because that's what people have been doing since forever. And that's a
yeah,
big part of mental
yeah.
health. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I agree, and I feel like also this, some of us need to learn how to set boundaries. Like you and I've had this conversation. So for me, this was a very important lesson to learn. But it's also perfectly okay to say, Vandita, I don't think I have the emotional bandwidth today to deal with this. I mean, I'll come off sounding like an asshole, but I should be okay sounding like an asshole rather than saying, Vandita, you're trauma dumping. As opposed to, I think that what's actually happening, you're right. I mean, one is it's a very the sort of Western model. But two is it's just mainstream to such an extent that we don't like. So it's kind of one of those situations where like be careful what you wish for. Like a decade ago we would never have imagined that every second person has an idea of depression, anxiety. So much good has come with it, which is why I'm like, you can't throw the sort of baby out of the bathwater. Thank God people are talking, and I know Gen Z does this much better than any other generation in India, for example, that we've heard of. Privileged Gen Z, of course, and privileged urban India. But I think that you have to constantly keep telling yourself now, and this is again, some more connected sort of algorithm driven behavior and stuff, is that you have to constantly keep just checking in with yourself to be like, am I actually feeling that way? Am I actually pissed that person shared that? Do I just not want to read that book? Maybe I just find it boring. Like maybe I'm not triggered. I'm just not interested right now. And I feel like we are, again, putting so much of the onus on people who have gone through something. Like, I mean, just to reiterate that point, is that I think that even as an editor, I have to be careful in my language to not to say that your experience is too real for me to share. It is to say that we're not the right fit. I mean, we're not the right place for you, and you have to. But it's always this balancing act, right? And I think that you talked about empathy a minute ago, and I think if empathy is at the core of what you do, again, honest, like actual empathy, authentic empathy. I think we're not empathy is now also been thrown out in favor of compassion, but at least authentically examining your motivation in any of these situations. I mean, not necessarily with your friends and in your regular life, but professionally, when you are engaged with community work in any way, when you're engaged with even online work or dealing with people, I think it would behoove us to check our own instincts and biases sometimes, and just be a little bit more aware of what's going on around us rather than just absorbing the latest trends and so on.
What you're saying is take me to one of our questions about infrastructure gaps, because for me, community models have always often been a way to plug that in. Like, therapy is expensive. So maybe I'm not coming to my friend for therapy, but if I could just talk to someone 2-3 times as a friend, I would need maybe 2 sessions a month, right? Like, so more centered on the question and not going on a tangent, is India also has massive gaps when it comes to mental health infrastructure. And you're really dealing with a country where most people don't have access to like a therapist. Psychiatric care is barely available in urban areas. And there's a lot of like mental health concerns that are created because of poverty, precarity, just people's life conditions. And I don't think individual therapy here is the solution, right? So, how do you think some of these systemic issues get not resolved, maybe, but find voice through storytelling without us just documenting despair, like just documenting that, look, these 5 things are so terrible?
Yeah, that is such an important question and such an important point. I think that the system fails people all the time. I think we know that. And there's no conversation you can have in this space without acknowledging the huge inequities, without acknowledging that therapy is expensive, we don't have enough psychiatrists or psychologists, and still saying that there is, an evidence-based system to deal with mental illness. But, even the senior psychiatrist like Dr. Patare, Dr. Samitra Patare told me, I think in one of our interviews, what you just said, by the way, is critical. He said, if you have more people who are sort of lay people, informed lay people, pulling their weight in a way, like, showing up to their community, showing up to their peers, you would have less of a load on, everybody doesn't need a psychiatrist. That's absolutely true. No, everybody doesn't need a therapist. And to think of it in terms of primary care and secondary and tertiary care, right? Like everybody doesn't have to, whereas you'll find that people often think they have to just jump straight to that. In India, though, I just feel like because there's so much of this kind of fog of ignorance and stigma and shame, part of the reason I feel that we have to acknowledge the systemic challenges and then not just stop there, right? And again, this is not for everybody. Everybody doesn't have to pick up I wish everybody would pick up one cause they really care about and like really go for it the way you have, and the way some of your peers have actually. But yes, the system fails people all the time. Yes, you're hearing more of this narrative on how the crux of everything should not fall on the individual. We need better sort of care providers, and we need more access. But the solution is not to just document all of this and then be like, chalo, mera kaam ho gaya, which, by the way, I might have thought at one point as a reporter, like, okay, but that is my role. The idea, I think, is to think beyond our silos. Okay, so we know all of this. It's very easy also, Vandita, I will say. I mean, I don't want to be glib about this, but I think despair is always there staring in the face. At one point, I was telling someone that the problem with working in a space like this, in whatever way, like I was always doing this on the side, with a paying job, because of course I could not, this would not, pay my bills. The problem is it's like a black hole. It's a void. Like as soon as you realize that, you're starting, or as soon as people realize that you have a little bit of interest in this space, you're kind of pulled into really stretching yourself way too thin. That's just personal experience. That's what happened with me. And B, you have to keep just checking against that despair. As I was saying, shore up your defenses and come back to what can I do? How can I reach out to someone who's in another silo who can do something else? How can we work with that person who's, maybe doing more on sort of in the grassroots space? And sometimes the best thing you can do is amplify the good work, right? You can amplify stories. Each of us can actually also, I say this sometimes as a little bit like hokey, but in these conferences, I'm like, each of us can actually just decide today we're going to go home and not only talk about mental health and illness in a conference hall or on a stage, but go home and find out how's my cousin doing, like how's my aunt doing? My grandmother's sounding very low today. Pick up the phone, check on the older people in your family, check on people and this is the only way that you'll end that stigma. So at some level we can help alleviate the pressure on this level while we wait for, or we work with advocates to improve systemic access of care. And for example, I mean, here I feel that you would have more to share on actually working with communities on ground. Like, so, we've said a couple of times, this is very much an online space. We've done events, but of course we've met our community. But at the end of the day, it is a storytelling platform. I think it's pioneering, and it's brought me a lot of joy and validation. But at the end of the day, it is a storytelling platform. It's not actually going to go in, raise funds for people to get therapy. We've dabbled with this idea of, would we ever want to become a service provider? And I just feel like that's a very fractious space. I'm not ready for that. But coming back to your bigger question, is for anyone who's listening or anyone who feels that this is an issue they care about, just do a little bit of homework and go and do something. Like, there's no need to fall into that pit of despair. And again, we don't have to feel like we have to bear the sort of entire enormity of that burden. But yes, we, I think, have a responsibility to do something, like that can actually have impact.
Thanks for that. I think the part you mentioned about each of us has a role to play. I feel like that's also very relieving to think about, that as an individual, you don't have to do everything, but you really have to figure out what's your role, and then kind of maybe get over yourself and be okay working with others. It took me a while because organizational or personal brand, and also everyone has a personal brand now, but that identity becomes so difficult because sometimes working together means letting go of personal glory and letting go of personal, even if it's not glory, just like the validation or dopamine hit you get out of feeling like you help someone.
Yeah.
In the collective, you lose some of that essence, right? And it took me a while to come to terms with, but that is essential for things moving ahead, that you are less important. The solution is more important than you are. Yes, I really like that part about the role.
Yes, but I will say you individually, Vandita Morarka, are very important. And let's not forget, so there are two different things happening. So I will just say for our viewers and listeners, if you keep this bit, Vandita and I have both spoken about this in the past. Like, I think we both have a tendency to subsume into the larger, for the larger good. But so for folks like us, it's also probably important to be like, hey, listen, there is a context in which Vandita, the individual, is super important. There's a context where Vandita, as the head of OFC and the founder, can pass the baton on. And this was something that I think we were talking about actually in back in August in Mumbai briefly, which is to say that I don't know that women especially, and there are so many women doing amazing work, unsung, no glory, no validation. I don't think women especially are encouraged to say, hey, listen, even if you do jack from tomorrow onwards, you still have value, You can still be who you are, get some plaudits or whatever it is. And I know this is like the sort of corollary and probably the unsaid corollary to what you were saying. But yeah, I think there's a beauty in subsuming your ego to the collective good and working with others and collaborating. And that's the only way it's not a vanity project, right? Like, honestly, like, there's so many vanity projects out there right now. We could probably list 10 of them in the next 5 seconds. But at the same time, saying that I derive great value and validation. And I've gotten so many kudos, and people have been so nice to me for the work I've done. But I don't need to just keep carrying that as a lonely load the rest of my life either. And that may not be my whole persona or personality. And even as you said, as a personal brand thing, you have to constantly, like, not constantly, but you have to kind of sort of regularly check in with yourselves to evaluate, is that the brand you want to take forward, as well.
That's a great question. Yeah, to think of that as part of your brand and as part of like who you want to be known for and what you want to be known as. That's quite lovely. I have a like small side question before I go into like a major question is given you've done so much work on like media and storytelling, is there still stuff on mental health that's not as talked about? Like I feel like anxiety and depression
Yeah.
is more known, but do people understand what schizophrenia is, for example? But I'm curious to hear from you.
No,
What's that?
exactly. Yeah, I think that someone put this the sort of the psychosis, the schizophrenia, the bipolar disorders, the I'm blanking on some of these, but someone recently told me, for example, even caregivers are given no attention, right? I mean, if you look at like how many people in this country are caregivers, usually again women, that is a burden, and you're told that that's also explaining why there's more anxiety and there's an uptick in stress for women who are often the invisible caregivers. There are I think in India, at least urban India of privilege, speaking in English, and in this space, we're still very uncomfortable talking about young death by suicide. And of course, here we should point out that there are helplines available, which we'll share, and that anyone feeling distressed should know that help is available, and they should not feel that they're alone. It's a very uncomfortable topic to talk about death by suicide. So I was moderating a panel around World Suicide Prevention Day, where someone whose son had died by suicide also shared that this is something they see with a lot of survivors of suicide loss. They don't get to talk about it. Someone else who'd lost their husband by suicide said you're not even given space to mourn or grieve because people are just so shocked by what has happened and automatically assign some of the guilt. They lay the blame at your door. So you can imagine someone who's bereaved, who's lost the person they love the most in their life, and yet not getting that kind of community sanction to grieve or mourn properly. And I think fundamentally that is super harmful. And that is, that's where we talk about stigma, and it's still very much alive. But I think it also speaks to our fear. Like, I think a lot of us are just terrified that, these are things that can actually happen, right? Like, you think that if you don't talk about it and you like shun that person and like just, yes, it's contagious, right? And this is what we need to change, and this is what we need to challenge. So for me, the heartbreaking part of all of this is that as much as you try to do in this space of storytelling and telling people that their voices matter, their stories matter, you will still hear of people taking this kind of sort of tragic steps. You will still feel like there's not enough impact in the world that you've made. There's also not enough that you can do. But worse than that is when I think we're failing young people. So I don't have the stats at hand right now, but it's pretty shocking how many young lives are lost to suicide. And then you hear that schools don't want to address it or talk about it because they're very worried about sort of, I guess, liability and things like that. Parents don't want these topics to be discussed. But we do need to understand that as a society we're really letting down our younger people, probably our older people also, because you think about senior citizens and what they're going through at this stage. So I don't think it's an easy enough question to answer, in the sense that we've made so much progress, right? So again, trying not to fall into that pit of despair, you have to say that, okay, look, but you and I doing a podcast today talking about mental health, which, would we have been able to do 10, 15? We might have wanted to, but would we have had an audience for? So I know people care. I think it's those of us who can find ways of doing the storytelling, amplifying the stories, sharing the stories, but above all, letting people know that there's always hope, that they're not alone. That's really critical. You equally need that pillar of people who are going and doing the advocacy and making sure that legislation changes and making sure that people know what their rights are. And you equally need the trained professionals, who are the easiest ones to, by the way, bash in this whole thing, because you're like, not enough of you, you're charging so much. And then you hear their stresses and what happens to them when clients ghost and awful things as well. But yeah, I think it's just a mixed. I mean, and India right now is at such an interesting position, right? Where you're kind of like, you really want to be positive about a lot of things, but there's just so much that needs to be done.
Oh, 100%. I'm going back to what you were sharing about systems also. There's just so much vulnerability in different forms that it's leading to really terrible mental health outcomes. A lot of it is social. So I think sometimes your mental health interventions don't help as much as well. And second, the care infrastructure in our country is pretty much crumbling, right? It really depends on the unpaid, unrecognized labor. Um, and that's not accounted for. There's no care for that. And I wonder what happens in the next 10 or 20 years when that care infrastructure crumbles. Because it's often been young women who are aging, and a lot of the younger women now don't want to do this. They don't want to do this unpaid work, which is just, it's treated in a derogatory way. So they don't want to take that on. So what does that do? Because you spoke about geriatric and like senior citizens and their mental health as well. I feel like there's a great gap in, I think, essentially being able to value care and to value it as something that you must invest in. And that's perhaps leading to some of the missing reporting, right? Because some of the missing reporting or storytelling is also a missing like narrative of resource. Like someone with anxiety needs very different resources than someone with schizophrenia. And the care infrastructure they need is also very different. So, what is easier to provide? Does that become the narrative rather than also focusing on where we're missing the mark and we're not able to do it?
And also, where are we finding it easier to have these conversations? So I'm now a little bit suspicious of those moments because you're like, oh, listen, um, and people have said this to me, like, "Oh, everybody's talking about depression. I mean, everybody is not, but, yeah, definitely there are more stories about depression, or you can find more people doing reels on anxiety or depression or whatever it is. Sometimes not very scientifically. And again, as a warning, please don't follow any of these influencers and what they tell you that they're doing versus, getting your own trained expert's opinion. Um, it's not one size fits all, but I do think that I'm a little wary of this. It's just I also find it hard sometimes to talk about some of these topics, and I have to sit with why is that, right? Like, and it's like, why do you feel that you're always going to be that person in a in a group who's going to bring everyone down, and yet some of the sort of most joyous and light and funny and full of laughter conversations have been about the heaviest topics, right? So it's like you have to constantly like examine like your skill and your motivation. And I don't think by any means we should all be like going and sort of forcing people to listen to us when they don't want to, because nobody wants to listen to your lectures. But finding that quiet time with people in your life, not just on a platform or on a panel or on a television channel, but finding that space for and pockets of grace for yourself and people you love and care about, checking on people who are going through a hard time, even if, yes, maybe they were trauma dumping and you're like, they don't care about me actually, but that you're kind of worried about them. Check on them, check on people. There's something to be said for that social net, that you were talking about earlier as well, like our role as a community. But yeah, there's just too many. I think we have these sort of like hardwired fears, which I think come out in some of the reluctance we have to talk about certain things. And I think the only way to deal with that is to bring those topics out into the sunlight in as friendly a way as you can and in as responsible a way as you can. But sometimes that's why I feel like we did kind of try to, maybe we over-indexed on comics and art and stuff like that. But sometimes it's easier to see and grasp, but that's the role I think art and great cinema also plays, right? Like great literature, great cinema, you can have a sense of empathy for the other thanks to these art forms.
Definitely. I feel like they can start a conversation in such a non-preachy way,
Yeah.
which really, it makes it more mainstream.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of what you were saying, I have also felt a similar approach from your end, which is beautiful when it comes to women's leadership. And the community building aspect of it as well. You started Tap in Tribe recently, which looks at women in leadership.
Yeah.
I'm curious how that intersects with health collectives work. Maybe not like programmatically, right? But in how you're thinking about it. Like, what is the relationship between women, their mental health, leadership, workplaces, and how important is that within the realm of women's leadership work as well?
That's a really good question. So programmatically, not so much, but I realized pretty quickly when we were doing these sort of training sessions, leadership training exercises, workshops in person, as well as the hybrid ones, that that there are two or three different aspects to this. One is, for example, the founders groups. You realize how much of a role mental health has to play. You realize that you need, it's just the stress levels are insane, literally, and no pun intended. The resilience required of you day after day, the motivation you need to be showing constantly. It's not a surprise that a lot of founders burn out because they don't have the time also, or perhaps sometimes the understanding that they require mental health support. For the women in leadership roles, very, very few perhaps have the benefit of having allies, advisors, sponsors, people who are invested in their growth. And, I heard early on, so again, I feel like I learned as much from participants as anything else, that, we're in a very rarefied space where we think that focusing on a career or focusing on your own drive or articulating your ambition, even, these are not bad words. I was told by a sort of younger member early on that, in my family, having like just career is a bad word. Like I'm not supposed to have ambition. It's just something I do until I get married. And, you're coming up against these kind of tropes constantly. And I think you can't pretend that you can't just wish them away, pretend they weren't there. You have to meet people where they are. And you realize the importance there of sort of peer support and allyship. So, there's a little bit of this common language and support structures that you can tap into. But I will say, Vandita, I feel like people are also very allergic to the phrase mental health. So you have to kind of like slip that. It's like the medicine you slip into and you call it something else. And, I mean, if I say emotional health, there's much less resistance. Or when we talk about resilience and what are those? Those are essentially, again, attempts at meeting people where they are, but dismantling the language that they're kind of resistant to, because nobody wants to, in a corporate environment, certainly acknowledge that there is some vulnerability. You can't. You probably shouldn't either, given the way our systems are. But I think that there is scope. And I will say that, having seen other people work on, I'm thinking of Arjun Gupta here, working on men's mental health. It's not my area, but I also understand very much that there's a huge challenge and issue there as well. I mean, I think men have so many roadblocks set up to them even articulating some of the, issues that face them. But 100% now, because it's easier to talk about stress and anxiety, and these kind of words have been defanged. You can find that even in a leadership conference or workshop. And I will say, even in a women's leadership conclave, I was actually very, very rocked by how intense and moving and vulnerable everyone allowed themselves to be. And that was my first experience of this kind of, immersive leadership training session. And I asked someone, I said, when you go for your leadership training, he was my partner. I was asking him, when you go for your leadership training sessions, are they like, very intense and people get very emotional? And he's like, no. I was like, I think for women, these are the only spaces you somehow have to yourself where you're not worrying about 20 other things. So we definitely need to find ways to build more of these support systems. But thank you. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Thank you for your support to Tap In Tribe as well. You're one of the champions, I think, when it comes to this space.
Thank you for sharing that. Also, what you shared towards the end about how spaces just change so dramatically when it's for women and perhaps when it's for men, when they're thinking about leadership. It's also taking me to how maybe different genders are approaching leadership or what they're taught about leadership. But also, like, it is a very lonely space for men and men's mental health. And to have spaces where they can talk to people. Like, I have friends who I don't think they have a single male friend that they can talk to about what they're going through. Some of them deal with severe mental health issues, and they don't have that support system. And this is where I feel some of the writing and some of the narrative work also, is that phrase of like, you're going to find someone who is going through what you're going through, or thinking or experiencing the world like you, maybe through like 300 years apart, and you're going to feel like a hand reaches out and holds yours. And I think that's some of the powerful work of the narrative pieces of the Health Collective also. And I'm sure that that's also true for Tap In, just in different ways. No, like sometimes it's through the written word, sometimes it's through a phone call.
Yeah.
But I do think it comes together for women and mental health and leadership as well. Yeah.
Mic drop. Thank you. Can I just frame this recording forever and ever for my bad days? And just like when I'm worrying about what am I doing in my life, I'm just going to keep this.
So, something throughout this has just been how much value there is in stories and in communities. And with the Health Collective, that's come together from a mental health point of view. But with Tap In, that's come together for women in leadership. But I do think a fundamental part of that is also wellness, mental health, whatever you call it, something that enables you to be a leader for the long term, right? And not just for some time.
Yeah.
So for people who want to share their stories through writing, art, or other forms, but they are scared, like I have been, of stigma, vulnerability, or even just, sometimes saying the wrong thing, because my personal experience of mental health may not fit into the politically correct way of speaking about mental health. So is there some guidance you'd like to offer?
I mean, the first piece of advice I would say is for, again, each of us, whether we want to share or not, is just to be less judgmental. I think it's, um, there's so many people I've heard who feel that, and this has been me as well, honestly, like none of us is always on point with every latest advice on like what's PC, what was PC yesterday is not PC today in the US. I mean, PC is not even PC anymore, right? So you kind of, you have to come back to what is it you're trying to share. I mean, I'm very much of the opinion that at this point in time where we're living in this age of ascendant AI, just check in about what you want to share in the first place. Do you want to be sharing with the world at large with an understanding that this lives on forever? Do you want to be sharing with a smaller group? Do you want to be sharing with your network? Do you want to be sharing anonymously with strangers? And there are options to do each and every one of these, right? There's, of course, the Health Collective, but there's also sort of a Medium, a Substack. There's never been easier to get your story out there and across. And I think my guidance for people is to not be it's easy to say not be scared, but I feel like don't worry too much about everyone else. And this is, by the way, even for women in leadership. This is also for people who want to share when it comes to mental health. No one is actually going to be able to support you from the get-go. I don't say this in a bitter way. I just feel like I have friends who love me dearly who were like, this is never going to work, you're insane, why are you setting this up, right? And I feel like I do have that kind of delusional optimism sometimes. When I think there's something I need to do, I need to do it. But there's no way that I was thinking 9 years. We didn't have a 5-year plan, let alone a 9-10 year plan, right? And I think Vandita also, as well as some of my early contributors and co-conspirators have heard me say along the journey that I'm going to shut it down. It's not going to work. We can't sustain. And what that means is you have to kind of go back to brass tacks and decide how, in what way, in what fashion is this serving you, and are you serving this? So coming back to guidance, stop policing each other, stop policing yourself. For me, my harshest critic is my internal voice. For some of you, that may be the case. For some of others of you, your harshest critics might be in your close circle of friends, and I would say get better friends. But also don't expose yourself to that for no reasons, right? So if you want to share something with your uh, peer group professionally, if not your immediate friends and family. And this is, again, this long-winded way of saying you don't owe anybody your story either, right? So it might be that you need to express yourself. You can write that in a journal. You can write that in an online journal anonymously. And I do think there's a great value in doing that. And great validation that will come your way as well. But you don't owe anyone in your own space, especially if they've not been supportive. You don't owe them your story.
That's really lovely. And honestly, the first time I've heard someone say that. Because it is an increasing fear and concern for me what I put out, what models it trains, who uses that data, and at some point how someone uses it against me. And just do it more easily than perhaps they'd be able to do it 10 years ago. Yeah, especially if you look at like companies hiring and doing like searches enabled through AI on a potential candidate. So it's really powerful to say that sometimes your story doesn't have to be a public story. Um, really thinking about the intent of why we're putting out that story. What are we seeking? Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Thank you. Before we end, something that we ask everybody, and I'd really like to hear from you as well, is what are some stories, storytellers, writers, artists that are working on mental health or adjacent narratives that you think our listeners should be following? Who's doing work that inspires you? And also, like, expanding what's possible in this space. I know you mentioned Sanity by Tanmay already. So we're going to link that in.
Yes, definitely.
But what else?
He's one of my favorite, obviously friends also, but also very inspiring. So a journalist called Raksha Kumar has set up a new reporting site called Mentality. So we're starting to share some of their stories to get them a wider audience. Her idea is to do original reporting on mental health from India. So the first story was on, the flood affected in North India and how they're still facing so much distress and trauma. So Mentality, I would say, check out. I love writers like Frederick Backman. So for fiction, anxious people, wasn't exactly about anxiety. It was super fun. I think I love the way he writes in general and is able to address a lot of these issues, but just in a very sort of like it's very holistic way, as in it's part of the storytelling. So not what we were talking about earlier. My friends also, I think, dealt with young, like just growing up and friendship and tragedy very, very well. There is Kiran Desai's The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny is one of my favorite books of the year. And it's not ostensibly about mental health, but everything is about mental health, right? So loneliness, literally. And then folks like Alison Bechdel, Are You My Mother? I like reading across genres, so I would say that's a good one. And even, this is again not really what my public persona would suggest, but books like James Norbury's The Journey, Charlie Maxey's The Boy, the Mole, and the Fox. Sometimes I just like these very zen, beautifully illustrated and written parables.
I love that we have such a range of recommendations. I also think sometimes just art and illustrations are easier
Yeah.
and they allow you to feel more gently. So I love your
Yeah.
recommendations. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. And thanks in general for this conversation. I think it's been great because I felt like it would be a conversation on like suffering and survival and like the difficult stuff. But I
Yeah.
also think it was just a conversation on joy and on life. Like, you know, that part where you said sometimes the most difficult conversations are the ones you've had with laughter. I really want for anyone listening in to be able to take that lens into their life and think that there are people, maybe not immediately around you, but you're going to find them where some of these very, very difficult things are going to feel like life and they're going to feel easier and lighter and it won't get better overnight. It really will not, but it will just not be as difficult or heavy to bear. So yeah, thank you for this.
I'm going to cry now. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you for this lovely conversation. Thank you for the work you've been doing all of these years and for our continuing journey. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
For anyone listening in, all of Amrita's novels and the Mindscape trilogy are available and you can purchase them pretty much like online, a lot of offline bookstores as well. And the Health Collective is available at healthcollective.in. We'll also include links to these resources and the Say Again podcast that Amrita hosts in our show notes. So this has been the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. I'm Vandita Morarka. Please follow us on Instagram, sign up for our membership, it's free, and subscribe to our newsletter. Shout out to Anjali on production and scripting and Kuhu on just overall coordination and support. Thank you so much for listening. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep finding new ways to make your voice heard through the written word.